everyone. Welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight, we are pleased to present Cynthia Saltzman, All But the Triumph of Painting Itself, the Legacy of Veronese's Wedding Feast. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight, we are pleased to present Cynthia. About that, everyone. A little backup. Before I introduce tonight's speaker and we get started, I would like to recognize that the New York Studio School's Evening Lecture Series is generously supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and many individual contributors. We are grateful for all of the support that keeps this series accessible, and please do consider making a donation either during or after tonight's talk by clicking on the support button on our homepage at www.nysss.org. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. Cynthia Saltzman is the author of Portrait of Dr. Gachet, The Story of a Van Gogh Masterpiece, and Old Masters, New World, America's Raid on Europe's Great Pictures. A former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, she is the recipient of a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation and has degrees in art history from Harvard University and the University of California, Berkeley. Her most recent book is Plunder, Napoleon's Theft of Veronese's Peace, published in May by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. In the New York Review of Books, Ginny Uglow recently wrote about Plunder. Her research is meticulous, but her style is light, enlivened by acute sketches of minor characters. The crowded scene of the wedding feast at Cana could almost be a model for the book structure. Now, please join me in welcoming Cynthia Saltzman.
Thank you, Erin, for that very generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here tonight at the New York Studio School. We're in the middle of Manhattan. In 2021, artists are painting canvases in a tradition that began in Europe over 500 years ago. And tonight we will look at one of the great canvases in this tradition, Veronese's Wedding Feast at Cana, and at the painting's origins, its fate, and its legacy. And here it is, an absolutely beautiful canvas, huge, 33 feet wide and 22 feet high, painted in 1563 by the Venetian artist Paolo Veronese to cover the entire end wall of the refectory of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. San Giorgio Maggiore was a rich and powerful Benedictine monastery that stood on an island across from the Doge's palace. The white facade is San Giorgio Maggiore's church, designed by Andrea Palladio. To the right are ochre-colored buildings that lead to the monastery's refectory. This canvas was painted in the 1720s by the Venetian view painter Canaletto, but this view looks very much the same today. In 1797, the French tore the wedding feast at Cana down from the wall of the monastery. They rolled the canvas onto a cylinder, rolled 4 other canvases on top of it, packed the cylinder into a crate, loaded the crate onto the deck of a ship, and transported it to France. 4 years later, the Veronese went up at the Louvre. In 1797, when the French seized this Veronese, Napoleon was leading his very first campaign in Italy. He was only 26. He was fighting the Austrians, who for over a century had occupied the Duchy of Milan. And this portrait was painted by the French artist Antoine-Jean Gros, himself only 25, on this Italian campaign. As Napoleon swept across northern Italy, he forced his enemies to hand over paintings and sculpture. He reached Venice in May 1797 and demanded the Venetians surrender 20 pictures. One was Veronese's Wedding Feast at Cana. Napoleon would go on to plunder not only the art of Italy, but later, when he was emperor of the French, also the art of Germany, Austria, and then not so successfully Spain. So why, in the book Plunder, did I tell the history of Napoleon's looting of Europe's art through the seizing of the wedding feast at Cana? First, the theft of this Veronese is emblematic of Napoleon's vast art plundering project. He wanted masterpieces, and he was ruthless in getting them. Also, fascinatingly, the fate of the wedding feast as plundered art was complicated and paradoxical. The French damaged the canvas and stripped Venice of one of its most extraordinary pictures. Yet at the Louvre, the Veronese would play a part in shaping 19th century French art, becoming an inspiration and a model to certain of France's great modernists, from Eugène Delacroix to Vincent van Gogh, painters who based their work on the study of color. The Venetians had pioneered the painting of oil on canvas, a technique that in Venice had particular advantage over frescoes. Frescoes fared badly in the saltwater climate of Venice, a city built on islands in a lagoon. With oil on canvas, artists could create rich effects of color and light. They could layer transparent glazes, articulate blacks and deep browns. They could build up paint and exploit brushwork to new effects. Also, compared with wooden panels, canvases were light. They allowed artists the freedom to paint in their studios and work for far-flung patrons. Painters could roll up pictures and have them delivered across the city or across the sea. This meant that Titian and Veronese could paint for patrons outside Italy and build international reputations. Famously, Titian stayed in Venice, but painted for Philip II of Spain, whose court was in Madrid. And here are 5 of the 6 paintings with subjects from antiquity, the so-called poésie, that Titian painted in Venice in the mid-16th century for the Spanish king. And I'm showing these gorgeous Titians because, as you no doubt know, they have been reunited for the first time in 4 centuries at the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston. Yet while the wedding feast at Cana was painted on canvas, it was created for a particular place, and it was never intended to be moved. And the advantage that canvases could travel proved a disadvantage to the Republic of Venice when Napoleon's troops invaded. Now, the subject of the Veronese. In the 16th century, it had become the custom in northern Italy for monasteries to decorate their refectories, their dining halls, with a painting of a New Testament supper. The most famous of these is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And here it is on the end wall of the refectory of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. The marriage feast at Cana is also a biblical supper, but completely different, as it is the most festive of New Testament feasts. Jesus attends a wedding, and in the course of the celebration, the host runs out of wine. Jesus is alerted to this, and he turns water, which is held in 6 stone water jars, into wine. And this is his first miracle. And what's wonderful is that Veronese sets this biblical feast in his own 16th century Venice. There are over 130 figures, many life-sized, and he dresses them in the silks and other fabrics for which the Republic of Venice was famous and that had generated some of its wealth. The canvas shows Veronese's brilliant way with color and his ability to create the illusion of reality, the illusion that the scene is taking place as though on a stage before the viewer's eyes. So what were the circumstances in Venice in 1563 that allowed Veronese to produce this extraordinary feast? Like many Renaissance paintings, the wedding feast at Cana began with a contract. And here's this contract stored today in the Venetian State Archives. It's written in Italian. At the very top, you will see the date, 6 June 1562. We, the prelate, Don Alessandro of Bergamo, procurator, and I, Don Maurizio of Bergamo, cellarer, with the present document declare that on this day, we agreed with the painter, Master Paolo Cagliar of Verona, that he will make a painting for us in the new refectory. It will be as high and wide as the wall, and it will cover it completely, and it will represent the story of Christ's supper at Cana in Galilee. And the painting will have as many figures as can fit comfortably and as are required by the subject. The 2 monks are speaking for San Giorgio Maggiore's abbot, Girolamo Scrochetto. Scrochetto was a sophisticated patron. He chose the subject, but by allowing Veronese to paint as many figures as can fit comfortably and as are required, he rightly gives the artist free rein to design the picture exactly as he likes. This celebratory subject was appropriate for a Benedictine monastery because, according to the rule of St. Benedict, all the guests who arrive will be welcomed like Christ, since he himself said, "I was a guest and you welcomed me." Also, the Venetian Republic had designated San Giorgio Maggiore as the place where its official guests would stay. Shortly before the abbot commissioned Veronese to paint the wedding feast, he had commissioned Andrea Palladio to redesign the refectory. And Palladio created a beautiful, narrow, white stucco room with tall windows on either side. And it's shown somewhat crudely in the 17th century print. But you can see the Benedictine monks seated at tables running down both sides of the room. The head table with the abbot is at the front, and above the head table is the Veronese. The painting is set into the architecture of the room, framed above by the cornice and framed below by the top of the wainscoting. And it runs all the way to the side walls. In the contract, the abbot had also spelled out the work that was involved before Veronese even began to paint. It was the craft of weavers, seamstresses, carpenters, and also workshop assistants. To begin with, the huge canvas had to be pieced together from lengths cut from standard bolts of cloth. And this photograph shows the way the canvas was made out of 6 strips of linen. The green lines mark the seams that held these 6 strips together. In the 16th century, throughout Italy, canvas or linen ran about 1 meter wide. This width was determined by the width of the hand looms on which weavers wove cloth. The bolts of linen may have been supplied by Veronese's brother Antonio, who worked in the textile trade as an embroiderer. So tightly were these seams sewn together that the vast, bare canvas would have looked like a single piece of cloth. This canvas was then attached with nails to a wooden stretcher or strainer, which in turn was attached to the wall. The large scale of the canvas meant that Veronese painted it on site in the refectory. So again, the contract. The abbot's scrochetto set a high level of ambition, not simply in the painting's size, but also with its colors, which he knew were what distinguished Venetian painting. Master Paolo, the contract states, will use the highest quality pigments and not spare any expense for the finest ultramarine. Ultramarine was the deepest, richest, most beautiful and expensive of blues. It was made from ground lapis lazuli and cost more than gold leaf. The word ultramarine means beyond the sea. The pigment was mined in Afghanistan and imported from the Levant. In the 16th century, the Republic of Venice was a maritime power. It stretched west on the mainland to Milan and east across the Adriatic to colonies in Dalmatia and on Cyprus. The city of Venice was a center of international trade. Venice was also the only city in Europe where pigments were sold not by apothecaries, but by vendicolori, color merchants, who also often stocked painting supplies, canvas, resins, gums, and solvents. In the 1990s, conservators at the Louvre analyzed paint samples from the wedding feast and confirmed that Veronese had followed the contract and had painted the entire expanse of sky in ultramarine. Veronese generally used fine materials, but he was practical, and like most 16th century painters, he wasted almost nothing and would forego an expensive blue if a less expensive blue would suffice. The choice of blues included azurite, which was mined from copper in Hungary or Germany, and also smalt, the cheapest blue made of ground cobalt glass manufactured on the Venetian island of Murano. Smalt proved problematic, and over time it shifted and turned gray. A dramatic example of this is visible in Veronese's Boy with a Greyhound, a painting at the Metropolitan Museum. To the left, the sky, seen through the tall window, was painted in smalt and was originally blue, but now is completely gray. Insisting on the finest ultramarines, Gros determined the painting's beauty and at the same time, the painting's afterlife. The abbot also demanded that Veronese, and not his assistants, will do his work as the painter, i.e. Veronese will paint the picture. He was well paid, 324 ducats, or 1/3 more than what Tintoretto would be paid for a crucifixion about the same size. But interestingly, if the abbot had instead bought quantities of Venetian silk equal to the size of the wedding feast, the silk would have cost about the same amount as the painting. And the abbot offered other compensations. As long as Veronese is working on the painting, the monastery will cover the cost of his food, and he will be able to eat in the refectory at no charge. Also, the monastery will supply a cask of wine delivered to Venice to be given to him when he requests it. The food and the wine were not simply acts of generosity on the abbot's part, but more likely attempts to make Veronese stay on the job. Paolo Veronese was by then 34, and he ran a large workshop and was in great demand. He'd been born in 1528 in Verona. That's his name, Veronese. In Verona, he'd been trained by his father, a stonecutter, to carve sculpture and architectural decoration. And then he'd been apprenticed to one of Verona's leading painters, Antonio Badile, whose daughter, Elena Veronese, would later marry. They would have 4 sons and a daughter. 2 of Veronese's sons and also his brother Benedetto would work in his workshop. In the 1550s, Veronese moved from Verona to Venice. Venice was a highly competitive field for painters, dominated by no less than Titian and Tintoretto. But Veronese had no trouble matching these rivals in invention and in scale, taking on complicated projects with multiple series of pictures and finishing these commissions on time. Veronese was a first draft painter. He rarely had to go over things more than once, rethink compositions, or fix mistakes. A 17th century biographer wrote, "He never put his brush in the wrong place." Even before he moved to Venice, Veronese had won major commissions there, including a commission from the Venetian government to paint ceilings for rooms of the Council of 10 in the Doge's Palace, the famous government seat. And one of these ceiling canvases, entitled Jupiter Expelling the Vices from Heaven, helped establish Veronese's reputation in Venice. It's brilliant and huge, 18 feet long, a sotto in su, or seen from below picture. The Council of 10 controlled Venetian state security, and this allegorical subject, the god Jupiter ridding heaven of evil, referred to the council's work. You have to imagine looking up at this picture on the ceiling overhead. At the top is Jupiter with his dark eagle, and Veronese shows his ability to create the illusion that the ceiling opens up and the figures in the picture's lower half, the vices, are falling from the sky. Characteristically, Veronese painted this violent scene in brilliant tones. Another extraordinary example of Veronese's ability to create the illusion of reality are the frescoes he painted in the villa of the brothers Daniele and Marcantonio Barbaro at Mezzer, some 40 miles from Venice. This is a villa designed by Palladio. At Villa Barbaro with frescoes, Veronese played with trompe-l'oeil, so the visitors walking into the hall would see on the walls painted images of the Barbaro family and members of their household who appear to be welcoming them. A young hunter seems to be stepping through a doorway with a hound at his feet. And you see high up on the wall, Veronese has portrayed Giustiniana Barbaro, standing on a balcony and looking down at visitors like us who have entered below. To the left is a boy, her son, who also looks up at her. Simply with paint, Veronese also turned solid walls into landscape views. Here to the left, Above a painted balustrade are painted landscapes invented by the artist. And at the end of the hall is an actual window and an actual balustrade. And through the windows, we see the fields of Mazères. It was in 1562, around the time he painted Villa Barbaro, that Veronese signed the contract for the wedding feast at Cana. Running almost the entire width of this 33-foot canvas is a table standing on a terrace, covered with a white tablecloth and seated with some 25 guests. And above the first terrace, Veronese put another terrace, and he framed the scene with soaring stone Renaissance architecture. By setting this biblical supper in 16th century Venice, Veronese created simultaneously a religious picture and an idealized portrait of Venetian society, close to its heyday, an image of Venice as he wanted it to be. By fusing the New Testament feast and a Venetian wedding, religious and secular subjects, Veronese literally evoked the situation of the Venetian Republic in which the church and the state were interlocked. To structure the drama of the biblical narrative, Veronese captures the moment when certain individuals recognize the miraculous wine. In the foreground, to the right of center, is the wine steward. And he raises his glass and is startled to see the red wine. And Veronese draws our attention to him with this beautiful white, blue, and gold damask. And he heightens the beauty of the fabric by showing light playing over it. A lot is happening in this picture. All the way to the left in the foreground are the bride and the groom. She is in white and blue and gold damask, and he's in red, blue, and gold. Further back are guests. Women in Venetian dress and men in exotic costumes. They are visitors from the Middle East, whose presence suggests the cosmopolitan character of Venice. All the way to the right are monks and others associated with San Giorgio Maggiore. Two of the monks wear black, and two of the figures up front are dressed in elaborate robes, one in blue with his back to us, and then one in yellow and patterned green. And they may be officials or laymen linked to the monastery. And in this group from San Giorgio Maggiore, Veronese seems to have put portraits of specific individuals. At the very center of the painting is Jesus. To his left is his mother Mary, and on either side are various apostles. Above, behind the balustrade, servants are preparing food and rushing with platters and plates. And the biblical symbolism is here. Directly above Jesus is a man in green who is raising a knife to cut meat. He is a symbol of the sacrifice Jesus will make. Below Jesus is a group of musicians, and on a table between them is a dark book of music and an hourglass. And the hourglass refers to a passage in the biblical text when Jesus says to his mother, "Mine hour is not yet come." In front of the musicians are these wonderful dogs, greyhounds, and one of them is eyeing a cat who plays with the water jar holding the wine. Veronese clearly loved dogs, and altogether there are 6 dogs in this picture. And with them, he adds notes of humor and also everyday life. In the 17th century, the artist and commentator Marco Boschini said that the image of the musician in white playing the viola da gamba was a self-portrait of Veronese. Whether or not this is true, what's important is that Veronese has put these musicians center stage, signaling the central place of music in the life of Venice, and more broadly, the central place of art. Now today, it's possible to get a sense of the way the wedding feast at Cana actually appeared in Palladio's refectory. In the 1950s, an industrialist named Vittorio Cini acquired San Giorgio Maggiore and renovated the buildings, which had been destroyed first by the French and then by the Austrians, both of whom used them as army barracks. And in 2007, the Cana Foundation commissioned a digital image of the Veronese feast to put on the refectory's end wall. So here is Palladio's beautiful white room with its tall windows, and the digital image conveys something of the way Veronese's painting, as it ran all the way to the side walls, worked with Palladio's architecture, and the way all Palladio's architecture literally framed the Veronese. Brilliant painter that he was, Veronese creates the illusion that the end of the room opens up and the banquet on the Venetian terrace is taking place just outside. This photograph also suggests the way the Veronese appeared to the French when they arrived in Venice in May 1797 and took the picture down, redirecting its fate. It was only 4 months before the French reached Venice that Antoine-Jean Gros painted the portrait of the young General Bonaparte in Milan. This was one of the very first portraits of Napoleon ever painted, and it established a dashing and a singular image, an image of Napoleon that we still have today. As he crossed northern Italy, Napoleon had demanded various Italian states put art reparations into the terms of the peace treaties. Before Venice, he'd seized 20 works from the Duchy of Parma, 20 from Modena, and 100 paintings, busts, vases, and statues from the papal collections in Rome. The high quantity of pieces demanded from Rome reflected the scale of the Vatican's collections of Greek and Roman sculpture, but also the taste for antiquities that had dominated the end of the 18th century. And this is the Vatican's famous Belvedere statue court, which contains some of the most famous of these ancient marble sculptures, the Apollo Belvedere on the left and the Laocoon in the center. These antiquities were the works of art thought to be the finest ever created and the ones the French wanted above all from Italy. This enthusiasm for antiquities had long shaped artistic tradition in France. In the 17th century, Louis XIV had established a branch of the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Rome, so that the most promising French art students could complete their education there, studying Renaissance paintings and ancient sculpture. When Napoleon ordered the Pope to turn over 100 works of art, his ambition was to transfer Europe's art capital from Rome to Paris. Meanwhile, the passion for antiquity was reflected in French painting, particularly in the neoclassicism of the most celebrated artist in France and the teacher of Antoine-Jean Gros, Jacques-Louis David. And here's David's Oath of the Horatii, a picture inspired by Roman history and painted in 1785, only a decade before Napoleon marched across Italy. On the left are 3 Roman soldiers, the Horatii brothers, and their father, who holds their swords in the air as they swear to fight to the death for the Republic of Rome. On the right, the female members of the family are already weeping. It's a moralizing picture of patriotic self-sacrifice. The philosopher Diderot praised David for representing the severity, rigor, and discipline of Sparta. David painted the scene with sharp contours and muted colors. He mixed the ideal and the real. The figures look like flesh and blood, but also like Roman sculpture. David's neoclassicism immediately caught fire, not only in France, but throughout Europe. Antoine-Jean Gros had been trained by David to paint heroic scenes from ancient history, like the Oath of the Horatii. Gros adored David and was one of his best students. He was charming, as in this self-portrait, but also neurotic. He had planned to study at the French Academy in Rome, but when, because of the revolution, it was closed down, he nevertheless insisted on leaving Paris for Italy. Because of the war, he got only as far as Florence and Genoa, where he struggled to make ends meet by painting portraits, something that as a history painter, he considered beneath him. After some time, he decided to return to Paris, but the letters that he wrote David were not answered, and he felt abandoned and depressed. Then in the fall of 1796, Gros learned that Josephine Bonaparte, who had been with Napoleon in Milan, was to visit Genoa, and he arranged through the French ambassador to meet her. And he asked if he could paint Napoleon's portrait. A chance, he realized, to paint not ancient history, but modern history. In this portrait, painted at Napoleon's headquarters in Milan, far from Paris, Gros breaks from the style of David, abandons the demeanor of a formal portrait with a close-up of a young soldier looking back at his troops in the smoke of battle, an image marked with new freedom in the handling of the paint. It was also highly idealized, casting Napoleon as a hero who could save France. Napoleon and Gros had each come to Italy for very different reasons, and their meeting seems almost accidental, the consequence of events set off by the French Revolution. Yet that Gros would produce an iconic portrait of the French general seems almost inevitable, given the long alliance of art and politics in France, an alliance understood and exploited by Napoleon. He immediately recognized the power of this portrait and asked Gros to have prints of the painting made so it would be widely disseminated. The revolution had indeed upended not only politics, but art. And by the time the ancient sculptures of Rome arrived in Paris, the French taste for antiquity had begun to fade. Napoleon was no connoisseur or aesthete, but he understood that Louis XIV and other French kings had used art and architecture to aggrandize themselves and to build an image of political power. And he would do the same with the art he commissioned and the art he plundered and brought to the Louvre. This is a 17th century print that shows the oldest part of the Louvre, a palace of the French kings at the center of Paris. Only 3 years before Bonaparte's Italian campaign, under the Reign of Terror, the revolutionaries had taken over the Louvre and transformed part of it into a public museum, and they had stocked the museum with the collections seized from the French king and from the nobility, many of whom had fled, and from the churches and monasteries they had closed. Paradoxically, the museum's purpose was to preserve works of art, but its collections were acquired by seizure and appropriation. Napoleon's looting of art from his enemies was, in a way, an international extension of the domestic policy in revolutionary France. Here is the Louvre's Grand Gallery. It had been built in the early 17th century by Henry IV, and it ran 1/4 mile and connected the Louvre to the Tuileries, another royal palace that stood at the end of what is now the Tuileries Gardens. Later in 1871, the Tuileries was torched by the Paris Commune and taken down. It was in the Grand Gallery that the revolutionaries put the new museum. And here is the Grand Gallery in 1801, when it was hung with over 900 pictures, both from the French collections and from the collections commandeered by Napoleon from Italy. This endless corridor of paintings dazzled visitors and put Napoleon as a collector on the level of the French kings. In the center, an artist sits on the floor with a sketch pad, copying a picture. And on the left, a woman artist stands on a platform with an easel in front of her, and she's climbed a ladder to get there. She's also copying. When the Louvre opened, David, who as a radical helped shut the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, argued that artists would now be free to choose their teachers by studying masterpieces in the museum. The Louvre, he said, would serve artists as an imposing school. In 1801, the Veronese went on view at the Louvre, and the French phase of its life began. Yet the Veronese's history with the French had begun long before and is linked to the history of French taste. In the 1660s, Louis XIV had tried, through his ambassador in Venice, to buy the wedding feast at Cana. In the early 18th century, the French critic Roger de Piel had called the painting all but the triumph of painting itself. Once in the Louvre, the wedding feast drew the attention of French commentators and artists. What struck them was the painting's realism. Next to this painting, all others, all without exception, look painted, wrote the historian François-Emmanuel Toulon-Jean in 1805. This is nature fixed. One of the first artists to study the painting was Antoine-Jean Gros. In 1803, Gros was commissioned by Napoleon, who was then first consul of France, to paint a propaganda picture that would recast the public's image of the Egyptian campaign, which had been a military disaster. The painting was to depict an actual event that took place on March 21st, 1799, when Napoleon had gone to a hospital in Jaffa to see French soldiers who were suffering from the bubonic plague. Gros responded to this difficult assignment with a brilliant canvas, Napoleon visiting the plague victims at Jaffa. Like the Veronese, it is very large, over 23 feet across, a complicated scene with multiple figures set into grand, and in this case also exotic, architecture. Gros shows Napoleon reaching out to touch one of the soldiers, and he based the pose on the Apollo Belvedere, a gesture that also alludes to the healing touch of Christ. Napoleon is a heroic figure capable of rescuing dying soldiers, but also implicitly all of France. But when the painting went on view at the Louvre in 1804, what struck the critics was the explicit account in these larger-than-life figures of the dead and dying soldiers. Immediately, the director of the Louvre, Dominique Vivant-Denon, called Gros' picture a masterpiece. Denon went so far as to praise the picture in a letter to Napoleon and to compare the richness of its colors and its atmospheric effects to Venetian painting. All the heat and the transparency of air in the climate and a magic in the chiaroscuro, he wrote, placed Gros besides Tintoretto and Paolo Veronese. What may too have been inspired by Veronese's wedding feast, a religious and a secular picture that invites various interpretations, was the complexity of the painting that tells more than one story. Napoleon's heroism is highlighted, but also undercut by the horror of the doomed men. In this way, Gros showed the cost of Napoleon's wars, a cost felt acutely already in 1804 by the French. Here too, Gros moves far from the neoclassicism of David. He exploits the freely applied color to convey an eerie and a tragic scene played out on a monumental scale. The painting would prefigure French Romanticism. Jacques-Louis David would also look to the Veronese as something of a model when in 1804, Napoleon became Emperor of the French and commissioned him to paint the coronation. Napoleon's coronation took place in an elaborate ceremony in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The emperor had forced the Pope, Pius VII, to come to Paris to crown him. In the end, Napoleon crowned himself. But David shows him in a less controversial pose, crowning Josephine. Throughout the ceremony, David and an assistant were sketching. The painting has over 100 figures, and David confessed he'd competed with the wedding feast at Cana. He described the Veronese as the largest painting in the world, and then claimed his coronation was larger, but it's not. Critics also compared the two pictures. One wrote, "This beautiful work reminds us of the picture by Paolo Veronese that we admired on the same wall a few years ago." Indeed, David had abandoned the precise contours and muted palette of his neoclassical history paintings. Another commentator argued that against the Veronese, the David fell short. he found that David had skillfully captured the stultifying atmosphere of the event in the cathedral. No air, no effect, no perspective, he wrote. He implies that David had skillfully conveyed the tone of Napoleon's increasingly repressive regime. With its profusion of detail, the painting was supposed to be a documentary record of the historic event. In fact, David invented and idealized. Napoleon insisted his mother appear in the picture, although she had refused to attend his coronation. And there is Letizia Bonaparte in white in the center, where she would have been seated had she actually been there. In retrospect, it's not hard to see signs of Napoleon's demise in this picture. He's no longer the heroic commander described by Gros or by David in this famous portrait of 1801, Bonaparte crossing the Alps. But here Napoleon is one among many, defined by the opulence of the costumes and much diminished. Again, David, like Gros, was too great an artist simply to produce propaganda. While paying tribute to Napoleon, he reveals certain truths about the political and social situation he had created in France. Napoleon's demise came 11 years later in 1815. When the Duke of Wellington, here the victorious general painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence, and the Allies, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. And afterwards, when Wellington and the Allied commanders arrived in Paris, they ordered Louis XVIII, brother of the late French king, whom they had put on the throne, to return the works of art that Napoleon had seized and sent to the Louvre. But only about half of the 250 paintings taken by the French from Italy went back. In 1815, Venice was turned over to Austria, and so the Austrians had to retrieve the Venetian pictures. And this is the Austrian foreign minister, the shrewd Clemens von Metternich, also painted by Thomas Lawrence. When the curator of the Austrian emperor's collections went to the Louvre to remove the Venetian pictures, Vivant Denon brazenly argued that if they shipped the wedding feast back to Venice, they risked damaging or destroying the canvas. This warning was conveyed to the Austrian emperor on the day he happened to be leaving Paris, and he agreed to let the Veronese stay in the Louvre. And here is the Veronese in the Louvre today, in a room with these beautiful dark blue walls, where it faces Leonardo's Mona Lisa. For more than 200 years, the Veronese provided lessons and inspiration to painters, and indeed served the mission that Jacques-Louis David had assigned the Louvre, that it be an imposing school. In the 1820s, in the aftermath of the empire, the great romantic Eugène Delacroix admired the wedding feast at Cana for Veronese's freewheeling handling of paint and his ability to convey the drama and describe a large cast of characters with minimal means. The feast of Paolo Veronese, nothing is like it, Delacroix wrote, and he copied heads of two of the figures in the painting. Delacroix had turned away from David's neoclassicism, from the high-minded moralizing subjects, the sharp contours, the worship of antiquity. The first merit of a painting, Delacroix wrote, is to be a feast for the eye. He painted huge, violent narratives, like the massacre of Chios. This is a horrific scene of contemporary history when on a Greek island of Chios, Ottoman troops killed thousands of civilians. And today this Delacroix hangs only a few galleries away from the wedding feast at the Louvre. Throughout the 19th century, the Veronese maintained its influence. Here's one of 6 copies of the picture painted by Henri Fontaine-Latour. In the span of only 5 years, between 1851 and 1856, according to the Louvre's Register of Copyists, 100 artists made copies after the wedding feast. Later, towards the end of the century, Vincent van Gogh looked to the wedding feast at Cana as evidence to prove some of his radical theories of color. And here is a Van Gogh landscape in the Metropolitan, wheat fields with cypresses, that manifest some of those radical theories of color. And also in the precision of the pattern strokes of paint, it also shows Van Gogh's highly intellectual approach to painting. Van Gogh painted this in 1889 when he was in the asylum at Saint-Rémy in the south of France. 3 years before, he had purposefully moved from Antwerp to Paris. Paris was at the end of the 19th century, as Napoleon had envisioned, the art capital of Europe, and thus the logical place for ambitious artists to go. And here's a page from a letter written in Dutch on October 28th, 1885, by Van Gogh to his brother Theo. And here he discusses the Veronese wedding feast. And in capitals, he writes, "Color expresses something in itself. One can't do without it. One must make use of it. What looks beautiful, really beautiful, is also right." And he goes on. When Veronese had painted the portraits of his beau monde in the marriage feast at Cana, then he flung a faint azure and a pearly white in the sky and in the architecture at the back, and it was right. That background is so magnificent in that it came about of its own accord spontaneously from a color calculation. By a color calculation, Van Gogh means that the colors with which Veronese had painted the figures in the foreground were what demanded he add to the background that faint azure and the pearly white. Van Gogh described his own experiments with color as originating with Delacroix and also the Venetians. Color, he writes, the thing undertaken by P. Veronese and by Titian. And indeed, Van Gogh's experiments did go back to the Venetians. And in this Veronese's case, to the ambition and sophistication of the patron who commissioned the wedding feast at Cana, the abbot, Girolamo Scrochetto, who in the contract for the painting insisted, Master Paolo will use the highest quality pigments and not spare any expense for the finest ultramarine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was wonderful. I'm going to invite everyone. I see some people raising their hand, but I request that you guys write your questions in the chat. I'm having a little bit of a technical issue right now, but if you could please type your questions into the chat box or into the Q&A, and I will relay them to Cynthia. Okay, see. We have a couple of hands raised, so I think we're going to be getting some questions in soon. In the meantime, Catherine Bickford says, amazing, thanks. So she really enjoyed this. We have another one coming in right now. One moment. Sorry. Oh, I think, Jamie, I saw that you had a question and then it disappeared. So if you could write that again. So sorry, guys. Well, in the meantime, I have a kind of a funny question for you. I love the image of David painting during that, or sketching during the coronation. And I wanted to know if you know why Napoleon's mother didn't attend.
Well, I think she was in Italy and she couldn't be bothered. And she also made, or she's said to have made some comment like, let's hope it lasts, or something like that. So,
order.
Yeah. So I think she, yeah, she couldn't be bothered. And nobody in the family was a big fan of Josephine's. So,
Man.
And she was becoming empress. So that wasn't so good.
I love it. I love all the drama. Okay, we have a question here from Hillary Ganton. She asks, do you think any contemporary artists are particularly interested in Veronese, influencing their work?
Okay, an artist today?
Yeah, an artist today that's looking at Veronese and thinking about his work.
Well, I can't name one, but I would certainly think that would be very interesting. Just the whole process of making this picture, I think would be inspiring. And also the way, as I say, he does so many things and tells more than one story. And the colors are, what was so interesting is that color obviously became one of the most important aspects of 19th century French painting. And it went way back. And so I think anybody who's interested in color, any painter who's interested in color, might learn a lot from looking at this picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine at the studio school, we create transcriptions from paintings to learn from them. And I can imagine this one, although I haven't done it myself, I'm sure I would benefit quite a bit from just, thinking about the color.
I mean, his technique was described, and I think people have agree with it. It was described in the 17th century as, painting painting everything in half tones, and then highlighting with lighter tones and putting the shadows in darker. So I thought that was, this seemed to be a very, very consistent technique with which he painted all this difficult drapery and the light, and never had to go over anything more than once.
Yeah, that's crazy. I was struck by that also.
Yeah.
Pretty wild. I mean, to have that kind
pretty talented.
Yeah, exactly.
But I also think that his whole style was very influenced by Central Italian painting, and the fact that he learned to carve stone from his father. I mean, all his figures have weight, and dimension, and I think they're sculptural. So that's behind all this very virtuosic painting.
Totally. Yes. Yeah. I have another question about color. You sort of just hit on this, but if you want to go into it a little bit more, Eve Ashheim asks, can you say more about how the color works in this painting, the red, green, etc.? You just sort of talked about that. So maybe.
Well, that's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, he really balances it out, here and there. And I mean, the red right in the front, and then the red over to the left. But also, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the man, to the left of the musician in white is a man in green. He's another steward who's organizing the feast. He was red until the 1990s. For a long time, he was dressed in red. And the French conservators decided that the red had been put on after Veronese had painted the picture, but they weren't sure exactly when. So he was painted, they took off the red and underneath was green. So that's interesting. And it does balance the colors more, having a green in contrast to the red.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, those are such central figures. So I think, making one green would make a huge difference.
But I think it's interesting what Van Gogh notices that, so much of the back, so half of the picture almost is pale architecture and that blue sky.
Yeah, totally. I love, how did he describe his color calculation? I mean, that's, intuitive painting, intuitive color painting. That's such a wonderful way to put it. Ami Brown Price writes, I guess like a continuation of what we were talking about with David. She said, didn't some of those who were not at the coronation try to pay David to include them in the audience, indeed put them in good seats so their portraits might be seen closer up?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I mean, I know that lots of people, when the people would go to David's studio and have he sketched their portraits in his studio and then sketched them right on the canvas. But I didn't know that people were, I mean, not surprised, of course. That would be only natural that they would want to be well positioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So funny.
They didn't want to, Napoleon's sisters didn't want to carry Josephine's train. So
yeah.
There was fighting about that.
Wow. I love all this drama. Catherine Bickford writes, where would we read more about the value painting process you described, painting in mid-value and returning to high and low values?
Almost anything you read about Veronese describes that. The books on Venetian art, the catalogs on Veronese. Xavier Salomon's catalog talks about that, and also books that, like Lauren Partridge's book on Venetian painting of the Renaissance. So pretty much, and also there's a great catalog, and the National Gallery of Art has a great catalog of its Italian paintings, and they describe technique in a very detailed way.
Amazing. Thank you for those references. I think this will be very helpful for people. Susan Welp asks, are there existing drawings for this painting that are out there?
That's also really interesting. No, there really aren't. There is a drawing at the Louvre of the painting, but people debate whether it was a drawing before or after. They debate, they're not sure it was really a preparatory drawing. Everybody figures he must have done. He was a great draftsman. He did beautiful drawings, and they figured he must have done drawings for this painting. And there's also, many of his paintings have evidence of the drawings underneath the paint that the conservators can see with technical equipment, but they don't see them in this painting. But that doesn't mean they think they were still there. It just means they disintegrated, when the paint was put on, or aren't visible.
Wow.
You couldn't just do it without drawing.
I wouldn't imagine with a painting like this, but yeah.
And he does amazing drawings where on a small scale, he conveys the energy and the movement and all the different figures. So
wow.
I don't know what happened to them.
Yeah, that's too bad. Paula Washstock asks, do you think that the wedding feast at Cana will ever return to its rightful place? After seeing it virtually, in its spot, it looks amazing.
What a question. What an amazing question. I think, I don't know. I think that it's a question for the diplomats, really. Yeah. But I think that by putting that digital image in the refectory, it's definitely not the painting. And I think the painting would be absolutely incredible there. And, It is where it should have been. It should have gone back, but it didn't go back. And in a way, this digital image, I think, does a sort of end run around that question of whether it will go back. I think it would. I think it's there are all sorts of practical considerations that get in the way, and also legally, the Austrians agreed to let the French keep it. They're signed. So
well, there you go.
Even though ethically the question is still the same. They shouldn't have taken it. They should have given it back. Legally, it's a different issue.
Yeah. It's sort of crazy. All the journeys of paintings, whether ethical or not. I wanted to ask you about the structure of the canvas. You mentioned that a little bit. I loved hearing that, the canvas itself is made up of these 8 panels, and it's woven together or stitched together. And can you really not see any sort of weave or stitch seam in the back, or?
Oh, you absolutely can see them.
Oh, you can. Okay.
You can. And in most old master pictures,
yeah,
because when pictures get lined, or they put a new lining on the back of the old canvas, they have in the past ironed that on and it flattens the canvas, it flattens the paint. And if you look with a raking light, I mean, you don't even have to look with a raking light, just go to the museum and look up and you'll see the lines.
Yeah, I've seen them before in paintings.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. For some reason, I thought you said that they created a seamless connection with this painting.
Well, they did. I think when the painting was originally made, it's just that when you put the paint on, and then they lined this picture and flattened the paint, and that brings the seams more to the front, and you can see them.
Yeah, wild. Here's a question that, as a painter, I get asked this, and I'm sure all of the other painters here do too. Do you know how long it took to paint this painting?
Yeah, it took about 15 months. That's it. Well, he had a large workshop, so he painted it, but he had people helping him. But he was very, very fast.
Yeah.
Like Napoleon racing across Italy, he too was very fast.
Sounds like it. And also all the food and wine that was provided to him, so he never left. I like that. It kind of reminds me of like all these businesses today that encourage people to never leave their office. Yeah.
You mean with the coffee machine and the free donuts?
Yeah, and like the ping pong table and the free food and stuff. Like bigger companies like Google and stuff have this like reputation for doing that now, and it's the same, psychology to sort of convince people to never leave. But it works, I think. Okay, well, I think we should probably wrap up. We're getting to our mark here, unless there is one final question.
I have one. I could say one thing that's interesting
yeah.
that I didn't put in the book, which is that I read when I was reading commentaries written by people who looked at the painting when it was in San Giorgio Maggiore. I read one by a woman in 1777 who came from England, and she went to San Giorgio Maggiore, to the island, to see the picture, and then she wrote that she wasn't allowed to see the picture, and that her male companion went in and said, "Oh, it's very beautiful," and everything, and it was because the monks didn't allow her in. And it made me realize that maybe no women, or very, very few, had ever seen the picture before it got to the Louvre.
Wow.
And so that's interesting.
Yeah, that's so wild, and heartbreaking, but totally interesting.
So it does show that at the Louvre it did have a wider audience.
Yeah. I loved hearing your descriptions of students and how it became much more democratic there and open to people. So good start to things, Okay, well, Cynthia, thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful and interesting, and I feel like I personally really enjoyed that, and I know our audience did too. So we'll stop there, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you for another lecture in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
It was really great.